The morning sun peeked through the blinds of the 23rd Precinct as Lieutenant Chen walked through the familiar glass doors, the smell of coffee already filling the air. It was just another Tuesday in downtown Atlanta, or at least that's what he thought. The weight of his badge felt comfortable against his chest, a reminder of his 15 years of dedicated service to the community. As he made his way to his desk, he couldn't help but smile at Officer Rodriguez, who was trying to explain to a rookie how to properly file digital reports. Chen had been in those shoes once, fumbling through the system, making the same mistakes every new officer did. Now, as a lieutenant, he found joy in guiding the younger generation of officers. "Morning, Lieutenant," called out Detective Williams from across the room, her voice carrying over the gentle hum of keyboard clicks and radio chatter. "That community outreach program you suggested, the chief approved it this morning." Chen's face lit up. He'd spent months working on a proposal to bridge the gap between local youth and law enforcement. It wasn't just about policing anymore. It was about building real connections with the people they served. Settling into his chair, he pulled up the day's reports on his computer. 3 domestic disturbances, a minor traffic accident, and, wait, something caught his eye. A pattern of car thefts in the neighboring district had been escalating. He made a mental note to brief his officers about it during the afternoon meeting. The morning crawled by with its usual parade of paperwork and phone calls. Chen took a moment to mentor Officer Taylor, a promising rookie who reminded him of himself when he first started. "Remember," he told her, watching her scribble notes eagerly, "our job isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about understanding people. Sometimes the best solution isn't in the handbook." Lunch came and went, a hastily eaten sandwich while reviewing case files. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the precinct windows as Chen wrapped up his shift. He'd stayed an extra hour helping Officer Taylor with a particularly challenging case involving an elderly resident who'd been scammed out of his savings. As the day wound down, Chen gathered his things, his mind already drifting to his daughter's science project that he'd promised to help with tonight. He signed out an unmarked police vehicle, standard procedure when senior officers needed to respond to emergencies from home. The black sedan was practically his second office, equipped with everything he might need for unexpected calls to duty. The parking garage was quiet as he walked to the car, his footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. Everything felt normal, routine, safe. The key fob chirped as he unlocked the door, tossing his briefcase onto the passenger seat. The engine hummed to life, and he pulled out into the early evening traffic, completely unaware that in less than 30 minutes, this ordinary day would turn into something that would change not only his life, but the entire department. He turned on the radio, catching the tail end of the weather report. "Clear skies tonight, perfect for helping with that science project." Traffic moved steadily as he merged onto the highway, his mind reviewing the day's events. That new community program would need careful planning. Maybe they could start with the local high school, build trust from the ground up. The sun was setting now, painting the Atlanta skyline in shades of orange and purple. Chen smiled, thinking about how his daughter always said this was magic hour, when the city looked its most beautiful. He'd taken this route hundreds of times before, could probably drive it with his eyes closed, though he'd never dream of it. Everything was exactly as it should be. Or so he thought. As he turned off the highway onto the familiar streets of his suburban neighborhood, he noticed something in his rearview mirror. A patrol car following at a distance. Probably just heading back to the station, he thought. But something felt different this time. The patrol car was matching his turns, staying consistently behind him. Ken checked his speed, right on the limit. His tags were current, his lights all working. There was no reason for concern. Yet, as he made another turn onto Maple Street, that nagging feeling in his gut grew stronger. 15 years on the force had taught him to trust those instincts. The sun had nearly set now, the streetlights flickering to life one by one. Chen glanced at his watch, 6:45 p.m. He should have been home by now, helping with that science project. Instead, he was about to discover that sometimes the most ordinary days can take the most extraordinary turns. Little did he know, the next few minutes would test everything he believed about his profession, his city, and himself. The regular day was about to become anything but regular. The patrol car's lights suddenly burst into life, painting the quiet suburban street in flashes of red and blue. Lieutenant Chen's heart skipped a beat, not from fear, but from confusion. He was driving an unmarked police vehicle, and his first thought was that his colleague needed assistance with something urgent. Following standard procedure, he pulled over to the curb, positioning his car under a street light for better visibility. His hand reached for his badge, a natural reflex after years on the force. Through his side mirror, he watched as a figure emerged from the patrol car, and immediately his training kicked in. Something was different about this stop. The approaching officer's stance was aggressive, weapon drawn. Chen's breath caught in his throat as he heard the sharp command. "Hands where I can see them. Put them on the steering wheel now." The voice was young, tense, almost shaking with adrenaline. Chen's mind raced, but his body remained calm, years of training taking over. Slowly, deliberately, he placed both hands on the steering wheel at the 10 and 2 position. "Officer," he called out in a clear, steady voice, "I'm Lieutenant Chen from the 23rd Precinct. I'm reaching for my badge." "Don't move. Keep your hands where they are." The young officer's voice cracked slightly. He was positioned behind his car door, weapon trained steadily through the gap. The patrol car spotlight now flooded Chen's vehicle, making it difficult to see anything in his mirrors. Living room lights began flicking on in nearby homes. A couple walking their dog across the street stopped to stare. Chen could hear the quick taps of someone's phone recording the scene, a sound he'd become all too familiar with over his years of service. "Officer," Chen tried again, his voice remaining professional despite the situation, "I understand your caution, but there seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm a police lieutenant. This is an unmarked department vehicle. If you check with dispatch, step out of the vehicle slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." The young officer wasn't listening, too focused on what he believed was a stolen police vehicle. Chen recognized the tunnel vision that sometimes plagued newer officers when adrenaline and training narrowed their focus so much they'd missed crucial details. As Chen carefully followed the commands, he thought about his daughter waiting at home with her science project. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just hours ago, he'd been teaching Officer Taylor about understanding people, and now here he was, caught in a situation that would test every bit of that wisdom. The cool evening air hit his face as he stepped out, hands raised slightly above his shoulders. The young officer, Officer Reed, Chen could now see from his nameplate, was still behind his car door, weapon unwavering. More cars were slowing down now, some stopping completely. Chen could hear the murmurs of gathering onlookers, the subtle clicks of more phones recording. "My badge is in my left breast pocket," Chen stated calmly, knowing how crucial these next few moments were. "I'm going to reach for it very slowly." He knew the wrong move, the wrong word, or even the wrong turn could escalate this situation beyond repair. "Don't reach for anything." Officer Reed's command came sharper this time. Chen could see the sweat on the young officer's forehead despite the cool evening air. Behind Reed, another set of police lights appeared in the distance, responding to what was likely called in as a high-risk vehicle stop. A small crowd had gathered on the sidewalk now, their whispers carrying in the evening air. Chen could hear snippets of their conversations, could feel the tension building in the atmosphere. This situation needed to be diffused and fast. "Officer Reed," Chen tried once more, this time using the young officer's name, hoping to establish a more personal connection. "I want you to take a breath and think for a moment. I'm wearing a police uniform. This vehicle has department plates. If you radio in the plate number, how do you know my name?" Reed's voice wavered slightly, uncertainty finally creeping in. Chen saw his opportunity, the first crack in the wall of adrenaline and assumption that had built up around the young officer. "Because we're on the same team," Chen replied softly, his voice carrying clearly in the now quiet street. "Check my vehicle's plates. Call it in. I'll stay right here, hands where you can see them. Let's work through this together." The distant sound of sirens grew closer. Chen knew that backup was approaching, which could either resolve this situation or make it infinitely more complicated. Everything hinged on these next few moments, on whether Officer Reed could push past his initial assumptions and really see what was in front of him. The gathered crowd had grown silent, phones still recording, as everyone held their breath waiting to see what would happen next. The red and blue lights continued their rhythmic dance across the faces of homes and trees, a silent witness to a moment that would soon change everything. Above them, the last traces of sunset had faded from the sky, leaving behind a deep blue canvas scattered with emerging stars. Chen remained perfectly still, his hands visible, his breath steady, as he waited for either understanding or escalation. Sometimes, he knew, the hardest part of being a police officer wasn't handling the dangerous situations, it was handling the ones that seemed dangerous but weren't. And as another patrol car rounded the corner, its sirens cutting through the evening quiet, Chen prayed this would be one of those situations that ended with understanding rather than tragedy. Time seemed to slow down on that suburban street, each second stretching like honey dripping from a spoon. Lieutenant Chen could feel small beads of sweat forming on his forehead despite the cool evening air. His arms were beginning to ache from holding them up, but he didn't dare lower them. Not now. Not when the slightest movement could make things worse. The approaching patrol car's siren cut off as it pulled up to the scene, though its lights continued their rhythmic dance across the neighborhood houses. Chen could hear car doors opening and closing, footsteps on pavement, radio chatter cutting through the tense silence. "I have a possible stolen police vehicle," Officer Reed was saying into his radio, his voice carrying in the still air. "Subject claims to be law enforcement, but—" A new voice cut through the night. "Reed, stand down." The command came from Sergeant Brooks, a veteran officer Chen recognized from inter-department meetings. The sergeant's flashlight beam swept across Chen's face, then lowered. "That's Lieutenant Chen from the 23rd. But Officer Reed didn't lower his weapon immediately. His hands were shaking slightly now, confusion evident in his stance. "He's in an unmarked vehicle that matches the description of." "Officer," Chen spoke again, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "Check the vehicle registration, it's department issued. I signed it out less than an hour ago." He could see more faces in the growing crowd of onlookers, illuminated by the strobing police lights. Some were still recording with their phones, others watching with concerned expressions. A young boy in the crowd tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom, why are they pointing guns at a police officer?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications that made Chen's heart ache. This was exactly the kind of situation that could damage community trust, the very thing he'd been working so hard to build. Sergeant Brooks was already on his radio, checking the vehicle registration. Chen remained perfectly still, knowing that while Brooks recognized him, protocol still needed to be followed. His thoughts drifted to his daughter again. She'd be worried by now. He was supposed to be home helping with her science project, not standing in the street with his hands up. The crowd had grown larger, their whispers creating a soft backdrop to the scene. Chen could hear snippets of conversations, could feel the tension in the air. Some were expressing outrage, others confusion. A few were making phone calls, probably to local news stations. This would be all over social media within hours. "Registration confirms it," Brooks announced, his voice carrying authority. "Vehicle is properly signed out to Lieutenant Chen." He turned to Reed, his expression firm but not unkind. "Lower your weapon, officer." The moment stretched as Reed struggled with the command, his training warring with his pride. Chen could see the exact moment reality hit the young officer, the widening of his eyes, the slight drop of his shoulders, the dawning horror of understanding. Finally, slowly, Reed lowered his weapon. The tension in the air shifted, like a rubber band suddenly released. Chen carefully lowered his arms, feeling the blood flow return to his fingers. His shoulders ached from being held in the same position for so long. "Sir, Reed started, his voice barely above a whisper. The young officer's face had gone pale, realization of what could have happened, what almost happened, finally sinking in. Chen took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. He could handle this one of two ways, with anger that might be justified but wouldn't solve anything, or with understanding that might prevent something like this from happening again. His next words would matter not just for Reed, but for everyone watching. The crowd was still there, phones still recording. In the distance, Chen could hear more sirens, probably responding to calls from concerned citizens. This incident would have repercussions, he knew. It would spark discussions, debates, maybe even changes in department policy. A cool breeze swept through the street, rustling leaves and carrying the scent of someone's dinner cooking nearby. Such a normal, peaceful smell in the midst of what had just happened. It reminded Chen of how quickly life could shift from ordinary to extraordinary, from routine to life-changing. He looked at Reed, seeing not just a young officer who had made a mistake, but seeing all the factors that had led to this moment, the training that might have been insufficient, the fears that might have been unaddressed, the assumptions that might have gone unchallenged. As Chen prepared to speak, he knew his words would need to bridge more than just this moment. They would need to address the larger issues at play, the systemic problems that had turned a routine drive home into a potentially tragic confrontation. The police lights continued their silent rotation, painting everyone in alternating shades of red and blue, a reminder that in law enforcement, nothing was ever just black and white. And sometimes, the most important moments weren't in the big operations or dramatic chases, but in these quiet moments of truth when officers had to decide what kind of law enforcement they wanted to be. Lieutenant Chen took a step forward, his movements deliberately slow and calm. "Officer Reed," he said, keeping his voice level, "let's talk about what happened here." The young officer's face was a mix of emotions, embarrassment, fear, and something that looked like relief tinged with shame. More senior officers had arrived on scene now. Captain Wilson from Reed's precinct stepped out of his vehicle, his face grave as he took in the situation. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger, their phones still recording every moment of what was unfolding. I got a call about a stolen unmarked vehicle," Reed started explaining, his voice shaky. The description matched, and I thought. He trailed off, looking at his boots, then forced himself to meet Chen's eyes. "Sir, I made a terrible mistake." Captain Wilson approached, his presence commanding attention. "Lieutenant Chen," he said, extending his hand. "I just got word about what happened. There was a glitch in our system. The vehicle you signed out was flagged as stolen due to a database error." Chen accepted the handshake, noting how the simple gesture seemed to ease some of the tension in the air. The crowd watched intently, their whispers creating a soft backdrop to the scene. Someone in the back called out, "Are you going to do something about this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Chen could feel all eyes on him, the crowd, the officers, and especially Reed, who looked like he was expecting the worst. This moment, Chen realized, was bigger than just one traffic stop gone wrong. "Captain," Chen said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air, "I'd like to handle this situation if you will allow it." Wilson nodded, stepping back slightly. Chen turned to face Reed, who straightened up instinctively. "Walk with me for a minute, Officer Reed," Chen said, gesturing away from the crowd. As they moved a few steps away, the young officer's shoulders were tense, expecting a reprimand. Instead, Chen asked quietly, "What was going through your mind when you first spotted my vehicle?" Reed blinked, surprised by the question. I was thinking about the alert we got about stolen police vehicles. About officer safety. About, he paused, struggling with his words. I wasn't thinking clearly, sir. I let my training take over without really seeing what was in front of me. Chen nodded, remembering his own early days on the force. The hardest part of our job isn't following procedures, Reed. It's knowing when to step back and really look at the situation, when to question our first assumptions. A cool evening breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the distant sound of city traffic. The police lights still painted the scene in alternating colors, but their intensity seemed less urgent now. In the crowd, people were lowering their phones, their expressions changing from anger to curiosity as they watched the two officers talking. "Sir," Reed said, his voice stronger now, "I understand if you want to file a complaint. What I did was inexcusable." He squared his shoulders, ready to face the consequences of his actions. Chen looked at the young officer thoughtfully. He could see something in Reed's eyes, not just regret, but a genuine desire to understand and learn from this mistake. Sometimes, Chen knew, the best teaching moments came from the worst situations. "A complaint won't solve the real problem here," Chen said finally. "What will solve it is understanding how we got to this point and how we can prevent it from happening again." He turned slightly, gesturing to the crowd that was still watching. "Look around, Reed. What do you see?" Reed scanned the faces in the crowd, concerned parents, curious teenagers, elderly neighbors who had stepped out to see what was happening. "I see our community, sir. The people we're supposed to protect and serve." "Exactly," Chen nodded. And today, they saw something that either reinforced or challenged their trust in us. Which do you think it was? The question wasn't meant to shame, but to teach. Reed's expression shifted as understanding dawned. "Sir, how do we fix this?" he asked, and Chen could hear the genuine concern in his voice. Chen smiled slightly, seeing an opportunity where others might see only a problem. "That depends," he said. "Are you willing to be part of the solution? Because I have some ideas about how we can turn this incident into something positive for the department and our community." The crowd was starting to disperse now, though many stayed to watch this unexpected turn of events. Captain Wilson approached again, listening as Chen began outlining his thoughts. The night air was cooling, but the atmosphere had warmed considerably from the tense moments earlier. Sometimes, Chen reflected, the most powerful changes came not from moments of confrontation, but from moments of understanding. As he stood there with Reed and Wilson, beginning to sketch out plans for department-wide changes, he realized that this night might end up making a bigger difference than he could have imagined. The next morning arrived with the buzz of phones and email notifications across both precincts. Video clips of last night's incident had spread across social media, sparking intense discussions in the community. Lieutenant Chen sat in his office, watching his computer screen fill with messages from fellow officers, community leaders, and local news stations. He took a slow sip of his coffee, thinking about how different this morning could have been. His daughter had hugged him extra tight when he finally got home last night, a science project forgotten in the worry of his late arrival. "Dad," she'd said, "I saw the videos online. Are you okay?" A knock on his office door pulled him from his thoughts. Officer Taylor stood there, concern written across her face. "Sir, have you seen the news? They're talking about what happened last night." Behind her, the precinct was unusually quiet, officers speaking in hushed tones as they gathered around their desks. "Come in," Chen said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Actually, I'm glad you're here. I want your perspective on something." He turned his computer screen so she could see the email he'd been drafting, a proposal for a department-wide training initiative. As Taylor read through the document, Chen's phone buzzed with a message from Captain Wilson. The captain wanted to meet with both Chen and Officer Reed that afternoon. The media was asking for statements, and the department needed to respond. "Sir," Taylor said, looking up from the screen, "this is different." Most officers would have filed a complaint, pushed for disciplinary action. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Why aren't you?" Chen leaned back in his chair, considering her question. Through his office window, he could see the morning sun casting long shadows across the precinct parking lot. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "the easiest response isn't the right one. Filing a complaint might make me feel better, but would it solve the real problem?" The morning turned into afternoon as Chen refined his proposal. Officers stopped by his office throughout the day, some sharing similar experiences, others offering suggestions for the training program. Each conversation confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't just about one incident, but about changing how they approached their entire job. At 2 o'clock, Chen walked into Captain Wilson's office, finding Officer Reed already there. The young officer looked like he hadn't slept much, but his eyes were clear and determined. On the captain's desk lay printouts of social media posts, news articles, and community feedback about the incident. "Lieutenant," Wilson began, "the media's asking for a statement. But before we give one, I want to hear your thoughts on how we handle this." He gestured to the papers spread across his desk. "The community's watching. Whatever we do next will send a message." Chen nodded, pulling out his proposal. "I think we have an opportunity here," he said, laying the document on the desk. "Not just to address what happened, but to prevent it from happening again." As Chen outlined his plan, he could see both Wilson and Reed becoming more engaged. The proposal wasn't just about additional training. It was about fundamentally changing how officers approached routine situations, how they handled their assumptions, how they communicated across precincts. "We start with joint training sessions," Chen explained, pointing to specific sections of his proposal. Officers from different precincts working together, learning from each other's experiences. We bring in community members to share their perspectives. We make this about understanding, not just procedures. Reed spoke up, his voice stronger than it had been the night before. "I want to help," he said. "What happened? It shouldn't have happened. But maybe we can use it to make things better." The afternoon sun cast warm light through the office windows as they discussed the details. Officers passed by in the hallway, some pausing to glance in, curious about what was happening. News vans had started gathering outside the precinct, their satellite dishes visible from the office window. "We'll need to present this to the police commissioner," Wilson said, reviewing the proposal. "But I think you're onto something here, Lieutenant. This could make a real difference." As they wrapped up the meeting, Chen's phone buzzed with another message, this time from his daughter. "Dad, my teacher asked if you could come talk to our class about what happened. She says it's important for us to understand these things." Chen smiled, showing the message to Wilson and Reed. "See? Change starts with understanding. And sometimes it starts in unexpected places." The day was winding down, but the real work was just beginning. As Chen walked back to his office, he could feel the energy in the precinct shifting. What had started as a potentially tragic confrontation was transforming into something else, an opportunity for real change. Officers were gathering in the break room, discussing the incident, sharing their own experiences. Chen overheard snippets of conversation about bias, about communication, about the need to do better. The walls between departments, between officers and community, were already starting to come down. His computer pinged with another email. The police commissioner wanted to meet first thing tomorrow morning. Chen sat down at his desk, looking at the family photo he kept there. Sometimes, he thought, the biggest changes started with the smallest moments. And maybe, just maybe, this was one of those moments. 3 weeks after the incident, the police department's largest training room was packed with officers from every precinct in the city. Lieutenant Chen stood at the front, looking out at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, all waiting to see what this new training program was about. "I want you to think about a time when you were absolutely certain about something," Chen began, his voice carrying to the back of the room, "and then found out you were completely wrong." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Officer Reed, sitting in the front row, nodded slightly, knowing exactly where this was going. The PowerPoint screen behind Chen showed a simple image, a dashboard camera view of an unmarked police vehicle. "This could be a traffic stop any night of the week," Chen continued. "But 3 weeks ago, it became something else. It became a moment that showed us we needed to change." In the audience, phones stayed tucked away, notebooks open. The usual chatter and side conversations that plagued most training sessions were notably absent. Everyone knew about the incident. They'd seen the videos, read the news reports. But now they were here to learn from it. "Officer Reed," Chen said, gesturing to the front row, "would you like to share your perspective?" Reed stood up, turning to face his fellow officers. His hands were steady now, his voice clear as he described that night from his point of view. "I was so focused on the alert about stolen vehicles," Reed explained, "that I stopped seeing everything else. I didn't see a lieutenant's uniform, didn't notice the proper department plates, didn't even question why a car thief would be driving exactly the speed limit." A few officers nodded in understanding. They'd all had moments of tunnel vision. The training session moved into interactive scenarios. Officers paired up, one playing a routine traffic stop, the other providing unexpected twists. They'd practiced stepping back, questioning assumptions, looking at situations from multiple angles. During the break, a veteran officer approached Chen. "You know," he said, sipping his coffee, "I've been on the force 20 years. Had something similar happen to me back in 08. But we never talked about it then. Just wrote it off as a misunderstanding and moved on." The afternoon session brought in community members to share their experiences. A local teacher described being pulled over 3 times in 1 month because her car matched a robbery suspect's description. A teenage boy talked about his first interaction with police, the fear and uncertainty he felt. Each story added another layer to the officer's understanding. Officer Taylor, who had helped develop part of the training program, led a session on communication techniques. "Sometimes," she explained, "it's not about what we say, but how we create space to listen." She demonstrated with role-play scenarios, showing how small changes in approach could lead to completely different outcomes. As the day progressed, the initial skepticism in the room gave way to engaged discussion. Officers shared their own experiences, asked questions, suggested improvements to the protocols being discussed. This wasn't just another mandatory training, it was becoming a conversation about real change. During one exercise, an officer raised his hand. But what about our safety? He asked. We can't second-guess every decision in dangerous situations. It was a valid concern, one that Chen had anticipated. That's exactly why we're here, Chen responded. The better we are at reading situations correctly, the safer everyone becomes, officers and civilians alike. He pulled up crime statistics showing how improved communication and assessment skills had reduced violent confrontations in other departments. The final hour of training focused on practical implementation. Officers worked in groups, reviewing real cases where quick assumptions had led to problems. They developed new protocols for cross-checking vehicle reports, improving communication between precincts, and handling high-stress situations. As the session wound down, Chen noticed something remarkable. Officers weren't rushing to leave like they usually did at the end of training. Instead, they lingered, continuing discussions, exchanging contact information, making plans to stay connected across precinct lines. Reed stayed behind to help pack up the training materials. "Lieutenant," he said, "I've been thinking. Maybe we could take this to the academy, talk to the cadets before they hit the streets." His suggestion showed how far he'd come from that night 3 weeks ago. Outside, the sun was setting over the city. Officers headed to their cars, carrying not just new training materials but new perspectives. Some were already planning study groups to dive deeper into the techniques they'd learned. Chen's phone buzzed with a message from the police commissioner. Other cities were asking about the training program. What had started as a response to one incident was growing into something bigger. As he packed up his materials, Chen thought about his daughter's science project, still sitting unfinished on their dining room table. Sometimes life's interruptions, even the scary ones, led to unexpected opportunities for growth. The last officer left the training room, but the conversations echoed in the hallway. Tomorrow, they'd all be back on the streets, facing real situations, making split-second decisions. But now they had new tools, new perspectives, and most importantly, a new understanding of what it meant to protect and serve their community. 6 months had passed since that night of the traffic stop. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the police academy's main lecture hall, where Lieutenant Chen and Officer Reed stood before a new class of recruits. The room buzzed with energy as future officers leaned forward, eager to learn from the story that had changed their department. "When I drew my weapon that night," Reed began, his voice steady and clear, "I thought I was following protocol. But what I really did was stop thinking." The cadets watched intently as he described the incident, not just the facts, but the emotions, the assumptions, the moments of realization. Chen observed from the side, noting how naturally Reed had grown into his role as an instructor. The young officer who once nearly made a tragic mistake had become one of the department's most effective voices for change. On the screen behind them, statistics told a compelling story. Reports of confrontational traffic stops had dropped by 40%. Community complaints were down. Most importantly, officer safety ratings had improved, proof that better communication didn't mean compromising security. "The hardest part of being a police officer isn't learning procedures," Chen added, stepping forward. "It's learning when to pause, even for just a second, and question what you think you know." He clicked to the next slide, showing bodycam footage from recent traffic stops where officers had successfully diffused tense situations. A hand rose from the middle of the room. "But how do you know when to trust your instincts and when to question them?" It was the same question Chen had wrestled with throughout his career. "That's exactly what we're here to figure out together," Chen replied, gesturing to the case studies they'd prepared. The cadets broke into small groups, each tackling different scenarios based on real incidents. The room filled with thoughtful discussion as they worked through the challenges. During the break, Reed pulled out his phone to show Chen something. It was a message from an officer in another state who had used their training methods to prevent a similar incident. "It's happening everywhere now," Reed said proudly. "Other departments are adopting our program." The afternoon session brought a surprise visitor. Chen's daughter, now doing a college project on police reform. She stood before the cadets, sharing her perspective as both a civilian and the child of an officer. Her presence reminded everyone that their actions affected not just individuals, but entire families and communities. "Sometimes the scariest moments can lead to the biggest changes," she told the class. "My dad could have filed a complaint that night and moved on. Instead, he chose to create something that's helping people across the country." As the training session wound down, Chen noticed something remarkable about this new class of recruits. They weren't just memorizing procedures, they were asking questions, challenging assumptions, thinking deeply about their future role in the community. Outside, the city was changing too. Community meetings once marked by tension now featured productive discussions. Citizens and officers were learning to see each other as people first, to look past initial assumptions and fear. The local news had run a follow-up story just last week, interviewing both Chen and Reed about the department's transformation. But the real story wasn't in the media coverage or the improved statistics, it was in the small, daily interactions that were slowly rebuilding trust. Later that evening, Chen sat in his office, reviewing applications from officers wanting to join the training program. His inbox was full of messages from departments across the country, asking for guidance in implementing similar changes. Reed knocked on the door, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Remember when you said we could turn this into something positive?" he asked, handing Chen a cup. "I don't think either of us imagined it would go this far." Chen smiled, thinking back to that night 6 months ago. "Sometimes the best changes come from the hardest moments," he said. "We just have to be willing to learn from them." As they discussed plans for expanding the program, Chen's daughter called. She had just presented her college project and wanted to share the feedback. Her professor had asked if she could turn it into a larger research study on community policing. The sun was setting over the city, casting long shadows through the office windows. In the parking lot, a new shift of officers was arriving, each one trained in the methods that had grown from that single incident. Each one carrying the potential to make better choices, to see beyond their first assumptions, to serve their community with greater understanding. "You know what the best part is?" Reed said, looking out at the city they served. "We're not just changing procedures, we're changing mindsets, and that's what really makes a difference." Chen nodded, knowing that while they had come far, there was still work to be done. But every new cadet trained, every incident prevented, every bridge built between police and community was a step in the right direction. Sometimes the biggest changes started with the smallest moments, like a routine traffic stop on what should have been just another ordinary night.